The frozen fog hung over the Ardennes forest like a burial shroud. At 5:30 inches the morning, the world exploded. 29 German divisions, over 200,000 men, came crashing through the snow-laden trees with a fury that hadn't been seen since the invasion of France in 1940. Tiger tanks rumbled forward, their massive guns lighting up the pre-dawn darkness. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that merged with the screams of men who had been sleeping peacefully just moments before. This was Hitler's last gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. American forces scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Green troops, many who had never seen combat, broke and ran. Officers tried to establish defensive lines, but the German juggernaut simply rolled over them. Within hours, the Wehrmacht had torn a 50-mile gap in the Allied lines. But there was one problem with Hitler's master plan. One crucial crossroads town stood in the way of his panzer divisions, reaching the port of Antwerp. Bastogne. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, was in Washington, D.C. when the Germans attacked. His executive officer, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was in bed at Camp Mormelin in France, recovering from the brutal market garden operation. The phone rang at 8:30 p.m. on December 17th. "Tony, get your boys ready to move. You're going to Bastogne." McAuliffe, a stocky artillery officer with a face like weathered granite, didn't ask questions. He knew what Bastogne meant. 7 roads converged there like spokes on a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the Ardennes. The problem? The 101st Airborne had just come off the line. They were supposed to be resting. They had minimal winter clothing, inadequate medical supplies, and ammunition for maybe 3 days of fighting. Most critically, they had almost no artillery shells. "How much time do we have?" McAuliffe asked. "You leave in 2 hours." The Germans are 18 miles from Bastogne and moving fast. What followed was a logistical miracle. Over 11,000 paratroopers were roused from their bunks, loaded onto trucks, and sent careening through the freezing Belgian night toward a town most of them had never heard of. They passed American units fleeing in the opposite direction. Beaten men with 1,000-yard stares. Some without weapons. All without hope. One retreating officer shouted to a passing truck, "You boys are heading the wrong way. The Germans are up there." A paratrooper shouted back, "We're the 101st, buddy. We're supposed to be surrounded." They reached Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before the German encirclement closed. What the men of the 101st found was chaos. The town was clogged with refugees, wounded soldiers, and retreating units. Artillery shells were already falling on the main square. McAuliffe set up his headquarters in the Heinz barracks on the edge of town and immediately began organizing a defense. He divided his forces into 4 groups, each defending a critical road. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment took the east. The 506th Easy Company, immortalized decades later in Band of Brothers, defended Foy to the north. The 502nd covered the northwest, and the 327th Glider Infantry held the west. They had 18 Sherman tanks. The Germans had hundreds of Panzers and Tiger tanks encircling them. That first night, Private Donald Burgett of the 506th dug his foxhole in ground so frozen it was like chipping concrete. He later wrote, "The sound of German tanks surrounded us completely. We could hear them moving in the darkness, their engines growling like hungry beasts. We knew they could come from any direction. We knew we were alone." By December 22nd, the 101st had been surrounded for 3 days. The weather was so bad that no supply planes could drop ammunition or medical supplies. Men were dying in aid stations because there was no morphine. Soldiers were firing 1 or 2 shots at a time, hoarding bullets like gold. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks because their boots had worn through. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite was claiming as many casualties as German bullets. That morning, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a typed message written in English. The Germans had done their reconnaissance. They knew exactly how desperate the American situation was. The ultimatum was delivered to McAuliffe at 11:30 a.m. It read, "To the USA, Commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA. Troops from total annihilation. That is, the honorable surrender of the encircled town." The message continued with barely concealed threat. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy A battalions are ready to annihilate the U.S. Troops in and near Bastogne. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. The deadline for surrender, 2 hours. McAuliffe read it once, then he read it again. His staff officers stood in tense silence, waiting for his response. Finally, McAuliffe crumpled up the paper and threw it on the floor. "Aw, nuts!" His staff erupted in nervous laughter. But Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard, his G3 operations officer, realized they needed to send a formal reply. "General, what should we tell them?" McAuliffe thought for a moment. Then a thin smile crossed his face. "What you just said would be hard to beat." "What did I say?" "You said nuts." And so one of the most famous military responses in history was drafted. The reply, in its entirety, was typed on official paper and sent back to the German commanders. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. The confused German officers asked Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered the message, what nuts meant. Harper grinned coldly. "It means the same as go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German major snapped to attention. "We will kill many Americans. This is war." "On your way, bud," Harper replied. "And good luck." The Germans didn't believe the Americans would actually refuse surrender. When they realized the 101st meant to fight, they were shocked and enraged. That night, December 22nd, the German artillery opened up with everything they had. The bombardment was the heaviest the paratroopers had experienced. Shells crashed into Bastogne in a continuous roar. Buildings collapsed into rubble. The aid station took a direct hit, killing wounded men in their beds. Private Burgett crouched in his frozen foxhole as the earth erupted around him. He later wrote, "The shelling went on for hours. You couldn't think. You couldn't pray. You could only press yourself into the frozen ground and hope that the next shell had someone else's name on it. I saw men go insane that night. Just stand up screaming and run toward the German lines until the machine guns cut them down." But dawn came, and the 101st Airborne was still holding, barely. On December 23rd, as a weak sun finally broke through the clouds, a young paratrooper looked up at the sky and saw something that made him shout. Within seconds, every American soldier in Bastogne was cheering. The skies had cleared. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes appeared on the horizon, their engines roaring like salvation itself. Parachutes bloomed across the sky, red, white, blue, and yellow, each one carrying precious ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Fighter bombers appeared next, diving on German positions with machine guns blazing. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed panzer columns, their rockets turning tanks into burning coffins. The tide was beginning to turn, but the most desperate fighting was still ahead. The Germans had invested too much in taking Bastogne to give up now. They would throw everything they had at the surrounded Americans, and in the snow-covered forests outside the town, the men of the 101st Airborne checked their weapons, counted their remaining ammunition, and prepared to hold the line. Because retreat was not an option. Surrender was not an option. They would hold Bastogne or die trying. Christmas Eve, 1944. In most of the world, families gathered around warm fires. Children dreamed of presents. Church bells rang out hymns of peace. In Bastogne, men prepared to die. The temperature had plummeted to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers could no longer feel their fingers or toes. Frostbite had become an epidemic. Medics were amputating frozen limbs with hacksaws because they had no proper surgical equipment. Men urinated on their rifle bolts to thaw them before combat. The supply drop on December 23rd had bought them time, but barely. Each paratrooper had maybe 20 rounds of ammunition. Artillery crews were rationing shells, firing only when German tanks came into direct view. The aid stations overflowed with wounded men lying in hallways, bleeding onto stone floors. And the Germans were coming again. At 5:45 a.m. on Christmas Eve, 18 German panzer tanks rumbled toward the village of Chomps, held by a single company of the 327th Glider Infantry. Behind them came 2 battalions of German infantry over 1,000 men, against approximately 100 Americans. The fog was so thick the Germans appeared like ghosts emerging from a nightmare. Their white winter camouflage made them nearly invisible against the snow. Private First Class Richard Ladd watched them come from his foxhole on the edge of Champs. There were so many, he later recalled. They just kept coming out of the fog. Hundreds of them. I thought, this is it. This is where we die. The American company commander, Captain Preston Towns, had 3 options: retreat, surrender, or make a stand, with no support and almost no ammunition. He chose to fight. The battle that followed was savage beyond description. German tanks rolled through the American positions, crushing foxholes with men still inside them. Machine gun fire raked the frozen ground. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the snow, bayonets and rifle butts against German combat knives. Captain Towns was hit in the leg but continued directing his men. When a Tiger tank broke through their line, he limped toward it carrying a bazooka. At 20 yards, he fired. The rocket struck the tank's treads, immobilizing it. The crew bailed out right into American rifle fire. But the Americans were being overwhelmed. Germans poured through gaps in the line. Towns ordered his survivors to fall back to a stone farmhouse in the center of Chomps. 23 men made it inside. They barricaded the doors with furniture and fired through the windows as German infantry surrounded the building. Panzerfaust rockets exploded against the stone walls. Machine gun bullets chewed through the wooden shutters. For 6 hours, those 23 Americans held that farmhouse against an entire German battalion. Just when ammunition was running out and the Germans prepared to storm the farmhouse, an impossible sound echoed across the battlefield: the roar of a Sherman tank engine. Through the fog came a single M4 Sherman, its 75mm gun traversing left and right. The tank commander, Sergeant Charles Assay, had heard the fighting from a mile away and driven toward the sound of the guns alone, with no infantry support, into the teeth of the German attack. What happened next became legend. Assay's Sherman engaged the German panzers at point-blank range. His first shot destroyed a Panzer IV. His second killed another. The German tanks, surprised by the sudden counterattack, momentarily pulled back to regroup. It was the opening Towns needed. He ordered his men out of the farmhouse in a desperate sprint toward American lines. Assay's Sherman covered their retreat, firing continuously, backing up slowly, buying precious seconds with each shot. A German anti-tank round struck Assay's Sherman, penetrating the armor and killing his loader instantly. Fire erupted inside the tank. Assay could have abandoned the vehicle and saved himself. Instead, he kept firing. His gunner, wounded and burned, loaded shell after shell. They destroyed 2 more German tanks before a second anti-tank round finally knocked the Sherman out completely. Assay and his surviving crew bailed out and ran through a hail of bullets. Somehow, miraculously, they made it back to American lines. Behind them, the Germans held Champs. But the 101st still held Bastogne. And Captain Towns's 23 men, now down to 19 survivors, had bought the defense another day. Christmas morning broke cold and clear. In Bastogne, there were no presents, no festive meals, no carols. There was only survival. The night before, Chaplain Francis Sampson had held a Christmas Eve service in a bombed-out chapel. Over 200 soldiers attended, many of them standing because the pews had been destroyed. In the candlelight, their faces looked ancient boys aged into old men by 5 days of combat. Sampson's message was simple. You are fighting for everything good in this world. Hold fast, have faith, and know that what you do here will echo through history. As he spoke, German artillery shells fell on the town. No one flinched. They had learned to distinguish between incoming and outgoing rounds by sound alone. On Christmas morning, the Germans launched coordinated attacks on 3 sides of the perimeter. They threw everything they had at the exhausted Americans' tanks, infantry, artillery. The assault was synchronized, brutal, calculated to break the defenders once and for all. At Foy, Easy Company of the 506th faced a full-scale armored assault. Lieutenant Dick Winters, who would become one of the most celebrated officers of World War II, organized a desperate defense with only 2 bazookas and 60 men. The Germans sent in 8 panzer tanks supported by 300 infantry. It should have been a massacre, but the paratroopers had learned something in 5 days of surrounded combat. When you have nothing left to lose, you become more dangerous than anyone with something to protect. Easy Company held Foy. Barely. By the end of the day, they had 7 men, still able to fight. December 25th became December 26th. The Americans had been surrounded for 7 days. Medical supplies were gone. Ammunition was critically low. The wounded were dying in agony because there was no morphine left. In his headquarters, General McAuliffe studied his maps by candlelight. His staff officers stood silently, waiting. Everyone knew the truth. They couldn't hold much longer. Another major assault, and the line would break. McAuliffe's radio operator suddenly straightened. General, message from 3rd Army. It's Patton. The room fell silent. George S. Patton, legendary, profane, brilliant Patton, had performed his own miracle. In 72 hours, he had disengaged his entire 3rd Army from fighting in the south, wheeled them 90 degrees north, and driven them over 100 miles through blizzard conditions toward Bastogne. But the final approach was blocked by German forces. Patton's tanks were fighting their way forward, mile by bloody mile. The message was brief. Hold on, we're coming. 4th Armored Division Spearhead should reach you December 26th. Should reach you, not will. Should. McAuliffe looked at his operations map. The 4th Armored was still 5 miles away. 5 miles of German tanks, artillery, and fortified positions. It might as well have been 500. He turned to his staff. Gentlemen, we hold for 1 more day. That's all Patton needs. 1 more day. Outside, in the frozen darkness, the men of the 101st Airborne cleaned their weapons with numb fingers, counted their remaining bullets, and watched the horizon for the German tanks they knew would come at dawn. They had given everything. Their blood had stained the Belgian snow. Their brothers lay frozen in foxholes, dead eyes staring at the winter sky. But they had not retreated. They had not surrendered. And on December 26th, 5 miles to the south, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the spearhead of Patton's 4th Armored Division, looked at his maps, checked his fuel gauges, and prepared to make the most desperate tank attack of the war. The race to save Bastogne was entering its final, brutal phase, and every second counted. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in the turret of his Sherman tank, studying the road ahead through binoculars. Behind him stretched a column of 37 tanks from the 4th Armored Division, everything Patton could spare for this final push. 5 miles. That's all that separated them from Bastogne. 5 miles of German panzers, anti-tank guns, and dug-in infantry who knew exactly what was coming. Abrams lowered his binoculars. His face, weathered and grim, showed no emotion. But everyone in his command knew the truth. This wasn't a tactical maneuver. This was a suicide run. Gentlemen, Abrams said into his radio, his voice crackling across the tank frequencies, the 101st has been holding for 7 days. They're out of everything: ammunition, medical supplies, hope. We're all they've got left. We go straight up this road, and we don't stop for anything. Not for casualties. Not for breakdowns. Not for hell itself. He paused, letting that sink in. If your tank gets hit, the column keeps moving. The 101st is depending on us. Patton is depending on us. History is depending on us. Let's roll. At exactly 10:15 a.m., 37 American tanks roared forward into the teeth of the German defenses. The Germans had prepared well. They'd positioned anti-tank guns in the woods flanking the road, creating a killing corridor. Panzerfaust teams hid in ruined buildings. Mines were scattered across the approaches. The first American tank made it 400 yards before a German 88mm gun found its mark. The Sherman exploded, fire erupting from its hatches. The crew never made it out. The column didn't stop. The second tank pushed past the burning wreck. Within minutes, it too was hit, slewing sideways and blocking part of the road. The third tank crashed through a fence to get around it and kept moving. Abrams's tank took the lead. He stood exposed in the turret, directing fire, seemingly immune to the bullets snapping past his head. His gunner fired on the move, each shot destroying a German position. Behind him, the remaining tanks spread out in a wedge formation, all guns blazing. It was brutal, mechanical warfare at its most primitive. No sophisticated tactics, just steel against steel. Courage against desperation. Captain William Dwight, commanding a tank company in the column, later wrote, "We weren't fighting a battle, we were driving through a slaughterhouse. Every 100 yards, another tank would brew up. You'd hear the explosion, see the smoke in your mirror, and know 3 or 4 more men were dead. But you kept going because stopping meant everyone dies, us and the 101st. While Patton's tanks fought their way forward, the Germans launched their final assault on Bastogne. They knew time was running out. They knew the 4th Armored was coming. This was their last chance to crush the 101st before reinforcements arrived. At 2 p.m., German artillery opened up with a bombardment more intense than anything the defenders had experienced. For 30 minutes, the world became nothing but explosions and flying debris. Buildings that had survived a week of shelling simply disintegrated. Then came the tanks, dozens of them, advancing from 3 directions simultaneously. General McAuliffe had no reserves left. Every able-bodied man was already on the line. Clerks, cooks, truck drivers, anyone who could hold a rifle was fighting. The wounded who could still walk had left the aid stations and returned to their positions. At the northwest perimeter, the 502nd Parachute Infantry was down to 87 men facing an entire German regiment. They had 6 bullets per man. No bazookas. No anti-tank weapons except determination. When the German tanks rumbled toward their positions, those 87 paratroopers did something extraordinary. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They fixed bayonets and charged. The Germans, shocked by this suicidal counterattack, hesitated for just a moment. In that moment, the last American artillery shells, literally the last 6 rounds in the entire perimeter, fell among the German infantry. The German attack stalled. The line held, but it couldn't hold much longer. McAuliffe knew it. His officers knew it. The men in the foxholes knew it. If the 4th Armored didn't arrive in the next few hours, Bastogne would fall. Private First Class James Hendricks of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion was manning a roadblock on the southern edge of Bastogne. He'd been there for 7 days, watching the empty road, hoping for relief that never came. His unit was down to 4 men. They had 3 rifles and 17 bullets between them. German tanks were visible less than a mile away, regrouping for what everyone assumed would be the final assault. Hendricks lit his last cigarette with trembling, frostbitten fingers. Behind him, Bastogne burned. Artillery shells fell in a steady rhythm. He could hear machine gun fire from every direction. "This is it," he said to nobody in particular. "This is where it ends." Then he heard something. A low rumble from the south. Not artillery. Something else. He squinted down the snow-covered road and saw movement. Tanks. His heart sank. More German panzers. Of course. They were going to hit from every side at once. But then he saw the white star painted on the lead tank's turret. The American White Star. "They're ours!" Hendricks screamed. "They're ours! They're here!" The lead Sherman Lieutenant Charles Bogus's tank from the 4th Armored Division crashed through the roadblock at full speed. Behind it came more Shermans, their engines roaring, their crews cheering, their guns already engaging German positions. Hendricks fell to his knees in the snow and wept. All along the southern perimeter, paratroopers emerged from their foxholes, staring in disbelief. Some laughed. Some cried. Most just stood in stunned silence as Patton's tanks rolled past them into Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams climbed out of his tank in the town square at 4:50 p.m. His uniform was torn and blood-stained. His face was black, with powder burns. Of the 37 tanks that had started the attack that morning, only 17 had made it through. But they had made it. General McAuliffe met Abrams in the square. For a long moment, the two officers just looked at each other. There were no words adequate for what had just happened. Finally, McAuliffe extended his hand. "How are you, Colonel?" Abrams, exhausted beyond measure, managed a thin smile. "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you, General." Behind them, paratroopers and tankers embraced. Hardened combat veterans, men who had seen horrors beyond description, openly sobbed with relief. The siege of Bastogne was over. The 101st Airborne had held for 7 days and nights against impossible odds. They had been surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned. But they had not retreated. They had not surrendered. And now, standing in the smoking ruins of Bastogne, surrounded by their dead brothers buried in the snow, they had achieved something that would echo through military history forever. They had proven that courage, determination, and sheer stubborn will could triumph over any odds. That night, as supply trucks rolled into Bastogne and the wounded were finally evacuated, the true cost became clear. The 101st Airborne had entered Bastogne with 11,840 men. They left with 9,500, nearly 2,000 casualties in 7 days. Some companies had suffered 80% losses. The 4th Armored Division lost over 600 men breaking through the German lines. The Germans had sacrificed tens of thousands trying to take one Belgian crossroads town. But the strategic impact was even greater. By holding Bastogne, the 101st had delayed the German advance long enough for Allied forces to regroup. Hitler's last offensive had failed. The road to Germany was now open. In his headquarters, General Patton received word that Bastogne had been relieved. He looked at his staff with fierce pride. "That," he said, "is the finest example of American soldiers fighting against desperate odds that I've ever seen. The 101st can now write their own history. They've earned it." He was right. But the story wasn't over yet. In the weeks following the relief of Bastogne, as Allied forces pushed the Germans back toward the Rhine, a team of intelligence officers entered the town to assess what had actually happened during those 7 desperate days. What they discovered shocked even the most experienced military analysts. The Germans had committed over 55,000 troops to taking Bastogne 5 full divisions, including elite SS units and some of Germany's best remaining tank formations. They had surrounded the town with more than 200 tanks and self-propelled guns. They had fired over 10,000 artillery shells into the perimeter. Against this overwhelming force, the 101st Airborne had fewer than 12,000 men, 18 tanks, and by the final day, almost no ammunition. But there was something else. Something the intelligence officers found in captured German documents that sent chills down their spines. On December 25th, Christmas Day, the Germans had been less than 2 hours away from breaking through the American lines. Their final assault had penetrated to within 400 yards of McAuliffe's headquarters. One more push, one more coordinated attack, and Bastogne would have fallen. The attack never came. Why? Because German commanders, studying their intelligence reports, became convinced that the Americans couldn't possibly still be fighting with such intensity unless they had massive hidden reserves. They didn't. The 101st was literally down to their last bullets, their last bandages, their last breaths. But they had fought with such ferocity, such absolute refusal to yield, that the Germans believed They were facing a force 3 times their actual size. The defenders' courage had become their greatest weapon. Private Donald Burgett returned to the foxhole where he'd spent 7 days. His entire squad, 11 men he'd trained with, fought beside, laughed with, were dead. He was the only survivor. He stood there in the snow, looking at the frozen bodies of his friends, and wept. "We won," he said to their silent forms. "We held them. You can rest now." Across Bastogne, similar scenes played out hundreds of times. Companies that had marched into the town 200 strong now mustered 40 men. Entire platoons had been wiped out to the last man. The town itself was destroyed. Every building had been damaged or destroyed. The civilians who had sheltered in cellars emerged to find their homes reduced to rubble. Yet they didn't curse the Americans who had turned their town into a battlefield. Instead, they thanked them. One elderly Belgian woman approached General McAuliffe with a small wooden box. Inside was her most precious possession, her grandmother's silver crucifix. "For the soldiers," she said in broken English, "so God remembers what they did here." McAuliffe tried to refuse, but she pressed it into his hands. "The world must remember," she insisted. "The world must never forget." In 1981, 37 years after the battle, a German general named Heinrich Freiherr von Lettwitz gave a final interview before his death. Von Lettwitz had commanded the German forces besieging Bastogne. The interviewer asked him about the surrender ultimatum and McAuliffe's famous "nuts" response. The old general smiled sadly. "We thought the Americans would be practical. We knew their situation was hopeless. Any rational commander would have surrendered." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "But we didn't understand Americans. We didn't understand that to them, impossible isn't a reason to quit. It's a reason to fight harder." That single word, nuts, it told us everything we needed to know. We were facing men who would rather die than surrender. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I will tell you something I have never admitted publicly. On December 26, when I learned that Patton's tanks had broken through, my first emotion was not anger or disappointment. It was relief." "Relief?" the interviewer asked, confused. "Yes. Because if we had taken Bastogne, if we had forced those paratroopers to surrender, or killed them all, I don't think I could have lived with what we would have had to do to achieve it. They had already cost us too much. They had become," he struggled for the word, "sacred, somehow, too brave to destroy." Today, in the town square of Bastogne, there stands a memorial. It's not elaborate, just a simple stone monument with an inscription. But on that stone are listed the names of the American soldiers who died defending the town. Paratroopers and tankers, officers and privates, black soldiers and white soldiers, fighting together in one of the first integrated combat units of World War II. Every year, on December 16th, the anniversary of the German attack, the people of Bastogne gather at that memorial. They lay flowers. They tell their children the story of the men who refused to retreat. And every year, a handful of elderly men in uniform stand at attention while a bugler plays taps. Each year, there are fewer of them. Soon, there will be none, but the legacy endures. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, went on to become one of the most decorated units in American military history. They jumped into Normandy on D-Day. They fought through Holland, Germany, and finally into Hitler's Eagle's Nest. But ask any historian, and they'll tell you, Bastogne was their finest hour. What happened at Bastogne transcends military history. It's a story about what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. The men who held Bastogne weren't supermen. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from New York. They were cold, terrified, and exhausted. Many had never been in combat before December 16th. But when faced with impossible odds, when surrounded and abandoned, when every rational calculation said they should surrender, They made a different choice. They chose to stand, not because they couldn't imagine defeat. They could. They saw it all around them, in the faces of the wounded, in the frozen bodies of their friends, in the overwhelming force arrayed against them. They stood because surrender wasn't who they were, because the men beside them were counting on them, because somewhere behind them were homes and families and a world worth defending. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, visited Bastogne after the siege. He walked through the ruins, past the burned-out tanks and the temporary graves. He spoke with survivors, heard their stories, saw the 1,000-yard stares of men who had seen too much. Later, he wrote in his diary, "The 101st Airborne stand at Bastogne is destined to be the great American epic of this war." These men have written a page in military history that will never be forgotten. He was right. 80 years later, military academies around the world still teach the Battle of Bastogne, not just as a tactical study, but as an example of what leadership, courage, and determination can accomplish against any odds. The lesson is simple and eternal. When everything is on the line, when the situation seems hopeless, when the easy path is to give up, that's when character is revealed. The men of the 101st Airborne chose to stand and fight. They chose to say nuts to defeat. And in doing so, they changed the course of history.